Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Mountain View Public Library's online event, Winter Fruit Tree Pruning. My name is Charles Mosner, and I'm a librarian here with the City of Mountain View. And before we begin, I'd like to give a big thanks to the UC Master Gardeners Program of Santa Clara County for making today's program possible. I also wanted to take a quick moment to thank you all for coming and to mention some brief housekeeping. So first of all, the program will last for 60 minutes. It will be recorded, and we will be sending out a link to the recording to everyone who has registered. If you have any questions, please enter those into the Q&A, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. You're welcome to use the chat for any general comments as well, but we won't be monitoring the chat. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this morning, UC Master Gardener, Alan Buchinski. Alan has worked at the Emma Prusch Park Farm High Density Fruit Orchard, where the trees are kept small and at a reduced height to make harvesting ladder free. And he currently works at the Marshall Connell Park. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to Alan.
Very good. Thank you, Charles. I will bring up my presentation and get going. So welcome, everybody. Thanks for taking the time. This is a fun presentation for me to do, and it is a perfect time. We have got great weather right now, and by doing it here midday, you could even take some of this knowledge and head out into the garden today and make some use of it. So just a couple things before we get started. If you're not familiar with the Master Gardeners, our mission is helping bring all that wonderful UC science-based horticultural knowledge to residents within California. And we have about 300 volunteers who help to do that. And we do that in person via presentations like this, whether they be virtual or in person. We've got a speakers bureau. We'll do different kinds of community events, field trips, etc. And we've also got a help desk. So if you've got specific questions, you can actually go to our website, which is listed right there, and submit a question and get an answer about gardening kinds of things. So, and then just one more thing here. Next month, we will actually be having one of our very knowledgeable master gardeners present on citrus. So if you're interested in that, January 11th, be in person at the Mountain View Library. Okay. All right, so moving a little bit more towards the topic of the day here. The Master Gardeners have a number of demonstration gardens throughout the county. The closest one to Mountain View is probably the Palo Alto Demo Garden, but there are some orchards. So if you're interested specifically in seeing how we prune trees, we've got a big kind of year-round harvesting orchard at Marshall Connell Park that is new in the last probably 7 years, I think. Charles mentioned the Emma Prusch Park orchards. There's a high-density orchard. There's also an international orchard, and then over closer to the airport, San Jose Airport, there's the Guadalupe Historic Airport. So you can use that QR code that you see right there to get to our website to see a little bit more information on those. I am actually also, let's see, going to put into the chat. Well, and actually I'm going to my next slide here. So with the agenda, so I'm going to do a little bit of an overview with some pruning basics. And then hop into the main part of the presentation, which is 10 basics of pruning. So this is information coming from UC Farm Advisors. Touch a little bit on tools and pruning systems, and then that's it. And that link that you see right there does have a copy of the slides here. So you don't have to actually grab all of these slides as we go. And in fact, I'll just drop that into chat right now if you want. But you'll be able to get all these slides in a PDF at your leisure afterwards. So let's jump into it. An overview. Okay, so UC has a lot of information on orchards, home orchards, and fruit trees. And it's such a popular topic. And homeowners have so many different kinds of trees, and we're able to make use of information that UC has developed for commercial growers over years and years. And there's a lot of different topics, as you see right here. And we're just going to touch on one of them today, that pruning and training. So if you've got questions on those other things, UC has information on them. And if you have specific questions, you can always come to our help desk virtually, drop us a, submit a question and we can help get you details. Okay. So reasons for pruning, and a lot of this is actually fairly obvious. One of the biggest things right there at the top is, trees need some maintenance. You get undesirable wood, if there is any disease or dead branches or crossing branches, so you want to take care of those and the size and the structure. So, that's one of the very biggest ones. And in fact, our recommendation is keeping trees at a reasonable height because, fruit trees growing to their normal heights of, 18, 20 feet high are going to give you not only more fruit than you're probably going to be able to deal with, but it's very difficult to take care of a tree that size yourself. So we generally keep our trees to a size that we can maintain without a ladder. And so the very biggest reason for pruning is just structure and having a strong structure from the beginning that allows light to get into the tree, which is good for the fruit, as well as over time renewing the fruit wood. So, once you learn the basics of how your particular tree forms its fruit, then you can actually prune to generate new wood year after year and keep your tree productive. So this is, if you remember one thing out of this entire presentation, this is probably it. I'll go into this a little bit more in detail in the slides, but pruning, of course, is a dwarfing process. It makes a tree smaller, and it's used for developing that structure and making it suitable for what you want, whether it's aesthetics or whether it's the fruit bearing, which is what we're focusing on today. And there's 3 different kinds of cuts. And, actually in the past, and you'll see in some places kind of 2 kinds of cuts of, heading cuts and thinning cuts. But in recent years, the thinning cuts have been broken out into these other 2 that you see right here. So a reduction cut, removal cut, and heading cut. And you might say, what are those? So let's go through each one of them. The reduction cut is you're taking a branch that's got branches coming off of it, and you're cutting to one of those branches that is big enough to assume the terminal growth. So you're actually doing a shaping operation on the tree. And in that diagram that you see right there, the illustration on the right, we're removing the piece of limb that's growing straight up in favor of one that's growing more laterally off to the right there. And so we're basically spreading out the growth. So this is sometimes also known as a thinning cut, as I mentioned, or even a bench cut, because you're kind of left with that bench right here. But this is one that is very useful. And it's a little different than the removal cut, which is where you take a branch that you're going to remove and you follow it all the way back to its source and you take it off right there. So that's a clean cut, and it says right at the collar. If you're not familiar with the term collar, it's just that little swelling at the base of the branch, and you don't want to cut into the collar. You want to cut to it. and cut, straight across it. So this is also known as a thinning cut. Both the reduction and removal cuts are thinning out the growth, but they're slightly different. In the reduction cut, you want to think of that 1/3 rule. In the removal cut, you want to come all the way back to its source but leave the collar. And then the heading cuts, you're actually just cutting indiscriminately through the tip of a branch. It doesn't matter if you're cutting a vertical piece or a horizontal piece. You're cutting between the buds. If you're cutting vertically, sometimes I call the heading cuts PG&E specials, because if you've seen trees that have been cut underneath power lines, they're basically just sawed off, and you get a lot of growth from these. Because it's invigorating the buds that are right there. You don't get the same type of growth for the heading cuts and the reduction cuts, which none of these are kind of quote unquote good versus bad. It's what your tree particularly needs. And one of the biggest points of this presentation is helping you understand, well, what are the ramifications of these different kinds of cuts? So we will touch on these again as we go through the presentation, but as I said, if you remember one thing, the 3 different kinds of cuts: reduction, removal, and heading cuts, very important. All right. So, and then here's just summarizing them in a single view. And one of the frustrating things is that when you go out and you look at your tree, it's not going to look like this. So, there's a little bit of, head hurting that's going on here. When you try to apply some of the principles as we go through this, but, hopefully conceptually you get it. And then once you put it to practice, it starts making more sense. All right, and then this is just another picture, and this picture we've got kind of divided between the left and the right, where the combination here of the removal and the reduction, the before and after, and the point of this picture is really all of this kind of this growth that you see from the heading cuts. You don't necessarily want your tree to look like that. You want it to look a lot more natural like this. And so, the removal and reduction cuts are things that you want to do more than the heading cuts. But there's going to be times, if you want to keep a tree to, 6 or 7 feet high, you're going to have to do heading cuts at some points in time. So, but you just want to know what's going to happen when you do that. And as I said, we'll touch on this some more as we go through. Okay. So, and then just ending with the little bit of the intro here is that, pruning is both an art and a science, and the 10 basics of pruning that are the core of this presentation that we'll start into next really look at the science piece. But as you try to apply those and you look at your tree, you realize, oh yeah, there really is an art to it, because you got something in 3D and you're trying to think now, how do I want it to grow and how can I make it grow that way? And you can't necessarily make it grow that way because Mother Nature is going to do what she wants to do. But then how do you take advantage of that? And so the experience is something that's really important. And then one thing I always encourage people is to avoid what I call the new pruner effect. And I've not actually seen this in the literature. So this is just kind of a personal opinion here, is that many people will learn the principles, go out and prune their tree and just not cut enough. And, one of the thinking, valid in a way, is that if you're not sure how much to cut, well, don't cut too much because you can always come back and cut later. Problem is nobody comes back and does that cutting later, and then they don't cut enough. And as we go through the presentation, you see, I'll touch on some of this about where that could actually be a problem, especially where I mentioned about letting light into the tree. So, we live in the Valley of Heart's Delight. And if you've got a tree planted where it's getting sun and you're providing enough water, it's going to grow like crazy. So you're really able to do a bunch of pruning on it and not damage the tree. Okay, so the 10 basics of pruning. And this is adapted from, as you see right here, from material that a farm advisor from UC had developed from his years and years of agricultural experience. So we'll start in with number one. And number one is just do most of your pruning when the leaves are off, because you can see the structure of the tree. And you see my asterisk right there, and that is a really important thing, except for apricots and cherries. And the reason for that is there's a disease called eutypa that they're especially susceptible to during the wet season. So apricots and cherries, the recommendation is to do the pruning for those in August. You want to let the wounds have a little bit of time to callus over before the rains come. But for the rest, the rest of the trees that go dormant, you want to do most of your pruning at this time of year because you can not only see what you're doing, but you're also invigorating all of those buds that you're leaving. So think of all the buds on a tree before you prune it. And of course, as the leaves drop, the energy from those leaves is actually being put back into the tree and into the branches and the roots and waiting until spring to come out. And if you cut off some buds, then all of that energy in the tree is going to be focused in the remaining buds. So they're going to be invigorated and you're going to get even more growth from those. And so that's important to know because you can actually encourage more growth on a tree by doing pruning. And then, there are pros and cons of summer pruning, and we'll actually do some. If you've got a tree that's just really vigorous and it just won't stop growing and just won't let light into the center of the tree, you might want to do some of that. But if you do, you want to make sure that you're thinking about sunburn, because opening up the inside of a tree to light in the middle of the summer could be an issue. So that's number one. And number two, so once you're out there and you're saying, all right, I'm ready to start, what do I do? And instead of having to think about all the structure of the tree and some of the principles that we'll be talking about in these pruning basics, you can start with just what I call the no-brainers. So things like if you've got a diseased branch, you just cut it off, no questions asked. A broken branch, cut it off. The suckers that are coming up from the rootstock at the base of the tree, cut them off. Water sprouts are these vertical growths that are coming up right in the middle of a tree. Generally, you'll cut them off, and then downward bending branches. So these are things where you just don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about it and considering, well, what's going to happen if I cut this? It's just, nope, no brainers. Cut them off and then start thinking about the rest. So that's number two. Number three is, if you do plant a new tree, if it's a bare root tree, or even if it's a tree in a pot that you get at a nursery and you put it into the ground and you've got this nice young structure right here, the recommendation is cut it off at the knee. And people hate to do this. They just absolutely hate to do it. And you might actually see some structure starting to form higher up here, and you don't want to lose that. But the recommendation is to do it because, if you do want to keep your tree at, 6, 7, 8 feet tall, then you want the early branches coming as low to the ground as possible. And the only way to do that is to cut it off this way so that you're encouraging the buds down here to actually send some growth out. And then after you do that, you paint the tree with white latex paint. Basically, it's sunscreen. So you want to especially cover the south facing side. Um, but be brave and cut this off. And you know, anecdotally, there's at the Marshall Cuttle Park orchard, we put in a lot of new trees, and the guy who heads up the planting of the orchard told me how you know, they had a group of master gardeners out there to kind of help plant. And after they planted the trees, he went around and he started cutting them off like this. And the other master gardeners were kind of looking at it and going, "Oh my goodness, what are you doing?" It's not something that necessarily feels good when you're doing it, but if you don't do it, you'll see that you've basically lost your chance to get the structure started out the right way. So that's number 3. So we've got number 4. All right. So when your trees are young, and this is broken up into 2 things here, which is, you know, a low vigor tree, which is really so most trees are relatively low vigor, and versus the very highly vigorous trees. I thought about actually not even including the vigorous growing part right here, because actually these 10 basics, the farm advisors, I've seen different versions of them, and in some cases they have not even shown this vigorous growing part. So if you're not sure if you got low vigor or highly vigorous, then treat it as if it's low vigor. And the hard part here is that you want to actually focus on the tree structure in the first 3 years and not focus on the fruit. So it's really, really hard to do this, because you put in a tree, you're putting it in because you want to have fruit on it, and that fruit forms on it, and you want to take that off in the first 3 years, or at least most of it off. And most people don't want to do that. But if you do that, you're actually basically instructing the tree, put your energy into the structure of the tree for the long term, as opposed to the short term for that fruit. And we'll touch on this horizontal branches a little bit later, but you want to, focus on some of those and leaving those to grow, because that's where you're going to get the fruit. If it is a highly vigorous tree, it can be pruned much less, but be careful. Don't try to convince yourself that, oh yeah, I got one of those highly vigorous trees and it doesn't need much pruning. The reality is most trees do actually benefit from structural pruning, especially when they're young. And if you do it, you will reap the benefits for years and years. Versus, and I have seen too many trees where people have said, "What do I do with this now?" And I look at it and I go, "Oh my goodness, well, maybe you need to start over, because fixing the structure of a tree that's several years old is extremely difficult to do." So that's number 4. Think about, focusing on the structure versus the fruit when the tree is young. Number 5. So let's just talk about horizontal versus vertical. We've touched on this just a little bit, but the fact is that, upright branches, those ones that are vertical, tend to be a lot of times even purely vegetative, meaning they don't have fruit. And they grow really fast too. So you'll find yourselves, if you've got those upright branches, you want to figure out how can we get them not being so upright. So whether doing pruning or by doing some training. So just know that horizontal branches are usually where you're going to have more fruit. And combination of the true is necessary, but because the horizontal branches today giving you your most fruit, and then something that's a little bit more horizontal but could over time bend down can be good. So what the advisors actually say is, things that 45 to 60 degree angle actually achieves a decent balance. And what you'll find is that, if a branch is at 45 degrees and you got a lot of fruit on it, by the end of the summer, it's not at 45 degrees anymore. And it might bounce back, and probably will bounce back some when you harvest your fruit, but it won't bounce back all the way. So it's going to get a little bit more horizontal, and that's not necessarily a bad thing because that's good for the fruit. But over time, you may want to have a new branch, and that's where those branches that are a little bit higher up, a little bit steeper angle, can be used in future years. So that's the renewing the fruitwood concept. So, how do you get the angles, right? And, because the trees don't necessarily just grow this way. One way is to do some training. And this is showing just a couple different things here. One is with spreaders and another is with tie downs. With the tie downs right here, this is just using twine with very small branches. And you can see it's really extreme in this case, is that the twine was put on this branch and it's bending it over backwards here, so it's pointing down. But what happens is that if you tie it down and you leave it tied down like that for the entire season, it'll bounce back only a little bit and it might be bent too far down. But if you only leave it for a couple of weeks, then you take the twine off, it's going to bounce back up and it's going to be at a decent angle. And there's no formula for this because the branches change in size and where you bend it will matter. So you just have to experiment with this. But be thinking from a principal perspective that having branches that are not quite completely vertical is a good thing for generating fruit. It's something to keep in mind as you're pruning. And just looking at this, I'll tell you, different trees have different propensities for growing vertically. Pear trees are sometimes can be really exasperating. They just want to grow straight up. And so you keep cutting them, trying to encourage the branches to grow out to the side, but they come out a little bit and then they grow up vertically, and you just keep going year after year, cutting them a little bit more to an outside bud. So that's number 5, horizontal versus vertical. All right, so number 6, deciding where to cut. So, I started off in the basics saying that, most important thing to remember are these types of cuts: heading cuts, reduction, and removal cuts. So the heading cuts will either top a vertical branch or they'll tip a horizontal branch. And if you're topping a vertical branch, you're basically going to be encouraging new growth, and it's probably going to end up being vegetative, and it's probably going to continue being mostly vertical. The horizontal branches, I don't know if you've had the experience of fruit trees that have had too much fruit. We just had something come into the help desk a couple of days ago where somebody said, how do I prune this peach tree? I've had problems with limb breakage. So if you have too much fruit, then the branches not only lean down a whole lot, but they have a tendency to break. And one way to prevent that is thinning the fruit, which is we're not going to cover a whole lot, but is something that's recommended. Another way is just tip that branch, that horizontal branch, so it can't have too much fruit. So it's a good way of keeping the tree small. It's a good way of protecting the branches from breaking, and from making it so that you don't have to thin out too much to prevent that breakage. The reduction and the removal cuts are very useful for opening up the tree to light. And but do keep in mind that if you're removing a horizontal branch or anything that is at 60 to 45 to 60 degrees, If you've got a lot of those, removing some of them is good because you're getting the light in, but everything's a trade-off. You may also be removing some fruit as well. And okay, let me just go back there. That is, deciding where to cut on the, additional principles of the heading versus the reduction and removal cuts. So that's number 6. Now jump into number 7. Some of these actually have multiple slides for these numbers. So that's what I hadn't remembered whether number 6 had a different ones. So cut location, number 7. So this is something that's really important, is that, a lot of times, especially on when you're cutting something vertically and it's got buds all up and down that shoot, you think, well, gee, if I cut the tip, then all of those buds are now going to send out new branches. And the reality is that's not true. You're probably going to invigorate the buds only, within 8 inches of where you're making the cut, not farther down the branch. So if you want to actually encourage growth down on a branch, then you have to cut down near that bud. It's as simple as that. And as I mentioned at the beginning, one of the reasons we prune during the dormant season is it's invigorating. And the more buds that you cut, then the more vigorous the new shoots will be, because the tree is concentrating all of its energy into those remaining buds. And heading cuts, those PG&E specials that I talked about on vertical growth, result in the most new shoots. And unfortunately, they usually have very narrow angles. So you don't often cut a vertical branch and then have the tree decide, oh, well, I'm going to send out a lateral from here. So if you want laterals, you can actually invigorate those buds, but you're probably going to have to do some training by, you can put some weights on those new branches. You can put some spreaders in, some tie downs, but you'll have to manage those narrow angles. And then one of the keys to remember is that the removal cuts and the reducing cuts, they can spur new shoots, but just not as much. And so you see these diagrams at the bottom where, the heading cuts, here it's cutting at the end, and you just get this vigorous new growth at the ends of them. And some growth back here, but less. In this case, it was a reduction cut right here, and you get more natural growth by doing the removal and the reducing cuts, and less of this kind of cluster growth at the tips of the branches. So certainly the encouragement is to train the trees using the removal and the reduction cuts where possible, and then using the heading cuts only where necessary. So that's number 7. So we'll continue on with number 7. So with the cut location, and I mentioned an outward facing bud a little bit earlier. I don't know if you caught that, but if you have a situation where you want to cut a branch and you're not sure exactly where to cut it, one of the other principles is, well, what do the buds look like? Because if you cut it right here, and you leave bud A, then you're going to have the growth coming up and toward the center of the tree, versus if you leave it so that you're cutting just above bud B, that is the outward facing bud. So you're going to be encouraging that outward growth. And so when you're cutting the branches, looking for an outward facing bud is something that's strongly encouraged. It's good practice. So you'd rather not have this, because you're going to end up wanting to prune this back because that's coming to the center of the tree, versus encouraging a little bit more lateral growth. It's not magic. Unfortunately, I mentioned those pear trees where you can cut to an outward facing bud, and that bud says, sure, I'll grow, but I'm going to start growing vertically. And year after year, cutting to the outward facing bud, and And maybe you may make some progress there, but sometimes the trees just need that training. So thinking about that bud location is very important. All right. So we'll move on to number 8, which is the recommendation is looking at the top of the tree. And if you're pruning in the top of the tree, you're actually helping the sunlight get into the lower part of the tree. And the reason why that's important is that sun-exposed wood remains fruitful and it produces the largest fruit. So those are both good things. And something I didn't really know. And so if you don't allow the sun into the center of the tree, then most of your fruit may be along the outside of the tree, which means you're getting less fruit. So if that's what you like for the shape and the shade and et cetera, that's perfectly fine. But do it because you're knowing it rather than because you didn't know that this was a fact. Because and as you see in that third bullet right there is that the shaded branches eventually will just plain stop fruiting, and they won't produce again unless you actually do some drastic pruning on the tree. And the key with the pruning is that the better you train your tree from the beginning, the smaller the cuts you make. The longer you wait and then have to fix it, then the bigger the cuts you have to make. And of course, the bigger the cut you make, the bigger the wound, and the greater the chance that there's disease is going to enter the tree. So that's not to say don't make the big cuts, because if the tree just, if you've got no choice, if it's, you may move into a house with a tree that just didn't get any pruning, you may need to make some big cuts. But by thinking through these principles, you will reduce the chance of having to make those big cuts in future years. Okay. So that's number 8. And then, supporting that right here, this is a tree at the, or, trees at the high density orchard down at Emma Prusch Farm Park. And in the winter, you can see in here, and boy, you see a whole lot of branches right here. You say, oh, that could probably use a lot of pruning right there. So you prune it, and there's light getting through everywhere because, of course, there's no leaves on the tree. And I guarantee it, if you're new to pruning, you're not going to prune enough, because you're going to say, I don't want to take too much fruit off of here. And these branches aren't too close. And yet, if you come out in June after the tree leaves out, then the picture on the right is what you're going to see. Is it's just going to be full of leaves, and there's not going to be any light going into the center of the tree. You have to, it really takes experience to cut enough so that you have light into the tree, into the growing season. And the only way you're going to really get a feel for this is practicing it, is, take note of it. And, in the winter, I would encourage you to, prune here and prune enough so you think it's going to have light in the tree all the way to the lower branches in June. And then examine your tree in June and see how'd you do. And if you didn't do well enough, make a note and prune a little bit more next year. And then, oh, by the way, you might do a little bit of summer pruning too. There's no reason why you can't take some of these branches out in the middle of the summer in order to help with the light getting into the tree. So that's number 8. Number 9, making clean cuts. So I mentioned the collar before. So if you look at this clean cut right here, some people will look at that and say, oh, you left a little bit of a stub there. And in the tree vernacular anyway, that's not considered a stub. That's considered leaving the collar, where you have the slight radius coming out. This is more the stub that you see in the second picture here, where it's not quite cut back to the collar. And that's considered suboptimal because then the stub is going to rot back on the tree, and you'd rather not have that. But it's kind of a Goldilocks thing. You don't want to leave too much, but you don't want to go too close either, because if you do this flush cut, you're opening up a bigger wound than necessary, and you're cutting into that collar. And yeah, I don't have material here supporting it, but the tree actually has protection, natural protection built into the collar. And if you cut that off, not only are you making a bigger wound, but you're removing some of the natural protections that the tree has. So you don't want to do that. And then you don't want to have this situation where you get the rip and the bark is not cut through. If you actually see this happening, that is actually a fairly common thing where you have hand pruners that are kind of loose. A lot of people have had loose scissors, and that doesn't cut paper very well. So you want your pruners tight enough so that they don't have this rip, but not so tight that they are hard to use. So those are the principles for the clean cuts. And that's number 9, and we'll continue with number 9. So, if you're cutting to a bud, you want to cut as close to the bud as possible, but not too close. So this is Goldilocks yet again. And so in this one on the left, you're removing wood at an angle. So you're getting basically enough wood, but you're not getting too close to the bud. So this third one right here is you're cutting so close to the bud that you might actually damage it. This one right here, the second one, is you're staying away from the bud. So this is almost like a mini stub right there. This one there's no angle and there's, kind of a stub. And oh, by the way, if you actually have a tree that actually has buds on both sides, then you want to stay away from the buds, but remove as much wood as possible, basically, for making the clean cuts. And, this is something that when I'm pruning, I think, all things being equal, I will try to make a cut that looks exactly like this. However, if I were making hundreds of cuts and doing a lot of pruning, sometimes I'd just prune really fast. And so the thing I'll do is just make sure that you're not actually damaging the bud when you're cutting, and make sure that you do have a clean cut, that your pruners are, sharp, and that they're tight enough that they're not kind of making a raggedy edge. So that's number 9. Okay, we'll continue with number 9, clean cuts. So if it's a small branch, you can just make a single cut through it, whether it's with hand pruners or lopper, and that's nice and simple. But if you do need to make a big cut, consider using a 3-cut system and or process. And the reason for that is that you would cut first right here on the underside of the branch. Then you cut all the way through out here. And then because as that heavy branch falls, the bark is going to rip, and the bark is going to rip only back to your first cut. And then you can make your final cut here at the collar, and you don't have so much weight there, and it's not going to actually rip the bark. So that 3-cut is a very useful thing. And then number 10, this is really important too, and you're not going to absorb all of the words on this slide at one time here, but it's basically know your plant. And you can know it by doing some research on it and by observing it. When the flowers come out this spring, look and see where the flowers are. Are they coming out on wood that is new growth that's coming out this year? Is it coming out on last year's growth, like for peaches? Is it coming out on spurs, like with apples and apricots? So know how your tree works. And if you've got questions on it, do the research. And if you're still not finding the answer, well, you can ask us. And just to give you an example, so, and this is experience can help too. And this is where observing the tree is important. So this is an apple bud. This is actually going to form a leaf. And this is a spur, and you're going to have flower buds coming out of this. And once you have experience, you can just glance at this and you know the difference. And you'd say, well, I don't want to remove this because I'm going to get flowers. But when you don't have the experience, you're not going to know. So, observe. And then, as an apple tree spurs get older, and the spurs can, they can last 10 years and they get bigger and complicated, they might look like this. And the last thing you want to do is remove all these tiny little twigs, because then you'll end up having no fruit. And then this is what an apricot spurs might look like. Here's a little spur coming off. Here's a mini one where you've got multiple buds right here. You might actually have flowers right there. So I love this illustration because this came out of a publication that was published in 1917. And, the trees haven't changed a whole lot since then. And this is cherry tree, where you're going to see these little spurs right here. You're going to have a bunch of flowers right there. So, watch your trees this spring and see where those flowers are coming. All right. So trying to keep an eye on time so we can get to some of the questions, but just a little bit on pruning tools. And so these are basically the tools that I use. I will use the hand pruners as much as I possibly can. The loppers are really handy for bigger things. The problem I have with the loppers is that, especially when I'm out in the orchard, is that when I want to use the loppers, they're generally over there. But the saw I can keep in my back pocket. So I'll use the hand saw for bigger branches a lot of times. But so these hand pruners are really useful. This little thing that you see over here, that's a carbide sharpening tool. As just there is a reminder to, keep your edges for the loppers and the hand pruners sharp, because it's gonna be easier on your hands, and it's gonna be better for the trees because it's gonna cut cleaner. And so just a couple things on here is that you may have some tools if you're buying new tools. Just remember that price is usually a reflection of quality, and these things can last a lifetime. So just because it's expensive doesn't mean it's going to work really well for you, but there's a correlation a lot of times. And I mentioned the three tools that I really like. And then if you do actually need a ladder, and I will, I prune my trees at home, and we prune our trees in our orchards so that they don't need ladders. But if you do actually need a ladder, UC recommends only a three-legged ladder, an orchard ladder, which is a tripod, because it's, four-legged, like a step ladder, is just not safe. It's not stable. And then just quickly here, the difference between a bypass and an anvil pruner. The bypass pruner is kind of like scissors, is that you've got the blade, it's only sharpened on one side, and it cuts right through this, it's called a hook right there. And it makes a clean cut, and it only crushes the branch on one side, which is the side that you're going to be discarding anyway. Versus the anvil cut, you're really, crushing both sides. Not, if this is all you have, you can use it. It's especially useful for cutting up dead wood because you can generate a little bit more power with it. But this is why we recommend the bypass pruners. And then just quickly, a couple things on pruning systems. An open center or vase shape pruning system is something that just, most every tree can be shaped this way. And again, we're talking about dormant trees, citrus, a lot of the growth principles are the same about where you make the cuts and how the tree reacts to it. But citrus doesn't care about the light so much, and it stays green year round. So you don't have to think about, training it quite so much. But for the dormant trees, start off by cutting them to, the knee height, and then oops, I didn't mean to click. Uh, and then figure out which are the lowest branches that are as evenly distributed around the edge, in a radial pattern. So 3 to 4 limbs that are going to be your primary branches, your primary scaffold. And then as they grow, you can allow them to split into multiple growths as well. So that you end up with this nice vase shape that allows light to get down into the tree. And Marshall Cottle Park, we basically do this in a 6 by 6 by 6 cube in the orchard. The tree is growing out um, and filling that space. So and the nice thing about this vase shape is that it's also relatively easy to kind of fix. Is that if you get one of these branches, one of these major scaffolds that gets disease and it's got to be pruned out, you can pick a smaller branch, down here and allow that to grow out. Versus another training system here. Oh, I cut off my G right there. Is that the central leader is where you start off exactly the same way, but then you let that first set of scaffold branches grow, and hopefully there's 3 or 4, as you see in the top view, centered around the tree, and you spread those out to grow as horizontally as possible. And then you allow this central leader to come up and you do it again. And you have another set of scaffold branches that are coming out. And you might have, in this case, we've got one set here, another, and then we're starting to have another right here. So you end up having kind of this layers of your tree. And this is just harder to maintain. And it's really discouraging if you spend a lot of time and work generating this central leader tree, and then you get some disease in here and you've got to cut some stuff off here. It can be really hard to regenerate that. And as much as this top view is just wonderful here, as you have 4 branches just perfectly evenly spaced. Mother Nature just doesn't grow that way, and it's just like, yeah, it's hard getting it to grow exactly the way that you want. Okay, so this is really zooming through all of this material. The key, if you need to go back to these slides, ask questions. The key is just understanding some of the basics. If you make a cut, where's it going to grow? Hopefully you can figure that out, and practice and develop some confidence by making the cuts and observing how the tree grows. It's hard because you're cutting in the winter and it's growing in the summer, and then next winter you're looking at it again and you're saying, no, how did I cut it last year? But make some notes if you need to. And there's a lot of material out there on the web. And again, I put that link in the chat earlier, and in fact, I'll put it in there again right now if you joined after I had put it in before, where you can get the slides for this presentation as well as links to not only this California backyard orchard, but there's a lot of videos that if you've got a peach tree, I would go to YouTube and say, how do you prune a peach tree? And look for extension sources. Like the University of California, UMass has a wonderful video, and we can point you to some if you need to. So with that, let's see. We can try to dig into some of these questions. Charles, have you been keeping an eye on some of these?
Yes, I have, Alan. So we do have a few questions here. I know we have just about 5 or 6 minutes to go here, but do we need to look for buds in the trunk below the cut? The question Madhu had earlier.
Was that bugs or buds?
Buds, B-U-D-S.
So no, not really. There's this thing called latent buds that are underneath the bark on trees, and so yes, you can look for them, but just because you don't see them doesn't mean there's not going to be growth. So cutting them at the knees is what you should do, regardless of whether you see the buds or not.
Great, thanks. And do you paint the entire tree with latex paint?
So that's a great question. And coat the bigger branches. You don't want to actually have to worry about painting the pencil-sized branches. And the reason for that is that the pencil-sized branches are going to have shade from those leaves anyway. So, plus it's going to be too much work. But really the key is anything that might actually be exposed in large part to the sun, and it's the bigger branches at the trunk. And generally, if I'm out there with some paint, is I'll go up until it starts being inconvenient, and then I realize, oh yeah, these smaller branches are going to be shaded by leaves anyway.
Great. And when you talk about cutting the tree off at its knees, is a pear tree planted last spring appropriate?
Oh, ouch. Yes, the simple answer would be yes. I actually have seen trees that were not cut at the knees, and the structure was so horrible that I said, you know what? If this were my tree, I would do it right now. So it's really painful to do. You've lost a year of growth, but the good news is that you haven't lost the root growth. So that tree has actually, developed a nice root structure, and you can go by that. But if you have a a horrible structure up above and you really want to start over, it's almost never too late. And in fact, I give an anecdote is we had a master gardener presentation one time. We had a marketing person from um, a nursery um, come in and talk to us, and they do demonstration orchards. And they had an orchard of, like, I think they said it was like 80 trees, and they kind of were done with their demo orchard. They were keeping them to a certain height, and they said, well, we don't need the orchard anymore. Should we just pull the whole thing out, or is there anything else we could do? And what they decided to do was they chainsawed them to knee height just to see what would happen. And only two of all of those trees died. So, Mother Nature doesn't want to die. It's horrible to have to do that, but you know what? If that's the only way to fix the structure, go for it. And I did actually see something come in here. We talked about the paint, how far up the tree, and it's like what kind of paint. It's latex, just latex paint that's diluted 50%. And generally we just use a light color. So, if you've got white paint, that's fine. If you have a light, pink or yellow or whatever, that'd be fine too. But 50% diluted latex paint. What else do we have here?
Moving on, yes, Cole is asking, can you comment on proper structures? How do you manage height for central leader style trees like apples and pears versus the open vase shapes for apricots? And what to do for bushing plants like figs?
Uh, yeah, so everything depends. You probably caught me uh, being a little judgmental about central leader trees just because I have actually tried doing some of them and I've had so much trouble with them. It's whatever you want to do. So, if you're going to do a vase shape, or you're going to do a central leader, you just want to follow these principles. And one of the big ones is that you want to make sure you're getting enough light into the tree. And I will say that if you're doing a central leader tree, you want to make sure that you're generous in having enough space between those layers of scaffold branches. The tendency, I think, is for people to actually have them be too close, and you end up with too much shade. And then you've basically kind of just ruined the structure there. And that's something that, uh, you know, I don't know that we've got a whole lot of central leader trees. You could come down to the Marshall Cottle Park Orchard or out to the Guadalupe and see what might be there. But it can be useful to actually see some tree structures to get an idea of what you want. And there are you can actually read a little bit more if you go to that link that I put into the chat.
Very good. And maybe a time for just one last question here. Nancy is wondering, can pear trees be structured in a vase shape? They grow vertically, as you said, in a leader structure.
Yeah, so yes. So, at least the UC farm advisors say that, just about any, dormant tree can actually be shaped into a vase shape. Because they grow so vertically, it's a challenge. So you're going to probably need spreaders or tie downs or weights on the branches. But yes, because if you get those branches, if you can force them to actually get big enough at a decent angle in a vase shape, then you've won the game. There is that you've got the structure, and now you can go with that. So the answer is definitely yes.
Well, thank you, Alan. It looks like we are out of time. On behalf of the Mountain View Public Library, I'd like to thank Alan Buchinski for generously sharing his time and expertise with all of us today. And thank you all for attending today's program. As a reminder, this presentation has been recorded and you will receive a follow-up email with a link to view the recording at your leisure. And we do hope you will join us again at another Master Gardener program in the future. So have a great rest of your day, everyone.